This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. Ahead of us on this Tuesday's program, we begin with K-State Professor of Plant Pathology, Chris Little. He discusses seedling, root, and stem diseases of soybeans, sorghum, and cotton. Also ahead, the Executive Director of the United Nations World Food Program, David Beasley, used a recent Landon Lecture at Kansas State University to discuss how man-made conflicts such as the war in Ukraine, global climate shocks, and COVID-19 have combined to increase world hunger to a staggering level. We end with K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk for this week's Milk Lines. He says dairy product consumption data from 2021 shows some interesting trends, such as continued increase in cheese, strong butter sales, and a resurgence for yogurt. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by Chris Little. He is a K-State professor of plant pathology, and he's joining us today to talk through some seedling, root, and stem diseases of soybeans, cotton, and sorghum. So, Chris, thanks for joining us.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, focusing specifically on these seedling, root, and stem diseases, let's start with soybeans. What did we really see?
Yeah, so we're always really concerned about a number of problems in soybean. The first one that's really caused a lot of issues is soybean sudden death syndrome, which is a soil-borne disease. So I think we're going to spend most of today talking about soil-borne diseases, pathogens that sit in the soil, cause problems. Sometimes you can't see or can't tell. But with sudden death, you can certainly see it because the leaves will start to become yellow, especially around the veins. They'll stay stuck to the stems, and it's really easy to see that disease pop up. And if you pull those roots up, sometimes there's root rot and that sort of thing. So, really there's a connection actually between soybean cyst nematode and sudden death syndrome. You usually find the nematode and you find the fungus in the same field causing problems at the same time. And so, one way to think about dealing with sudden death syndrome is to test your fields for cyst nematode. So you know what the populations are, you know what kind of resistance you need to be putting out there. You can send samples into K-State Plant Disease Diagnostic Lab, and there's groups that will get them tested for you. And if you can control the nematode, you can often control your SDS problems as well. So it's a root pathogen, but it also manifests itself in terms of the foliar symptoms and also reduced yields at the end of the season, which is what we really care about.
Yeah, absolutely, especially in a year like this year where it's been so dry that anything we have gotten grown, you really want to preserve that.
Yeah, and the thing is, when it's dry like this, we have another disease problem that shows up, and that's charcoal rot. And charcoal rot's pretty easy to see, even at 65 miles an hour from the road, because you'll see areas in your field when it's really hot and really dry that start to go down, start to senesce a little bit before everybody else in the field starts to senesce. And you can go out in the field and find plants that are wilting before everybody else and pull them up and see little black discoloration or gray discoloration on the roots, So the fungus is, in this case, is colonizing the roots. And again, it's kind of being sneaky down there, and really robbing your yield. So we had a warm, dry summer, and I think that we're going to have some charcoal rot impacts as well around the state.
Absolutely. In terms of treating that one, is it something you should be proactive about, quite like soybean sudden death syndrome?
Yeah, you can, and I think one of the things that we have to do there is really be on the lookout for germplasm seed that doesn't mature, during the hottest part of the year. And some years that's difficult, because whenever the plant is maturing and producing seed during the most stressful parts of the year, that puts a lot of stress on the plant, and that stress can really lead to more disease. There's lots of practical control, too. Anything that causes stress. So plant populations that are too high, weeds, those kind of things can all stress the plants and cause them to be more susceptible to charcoal rot. So, yeah, two different diseases, SDS and charcoal rot, but they can coexist in the same field. Sometimes they can occur in the same season. And I think this is a year where you'll get a patch of moisture here and then a long, hot, dry spell, and so you'll have conditions that are favorable for both of those problems.
Lots of good information there. Testing, first and foremost, now's the time to do it with harvest complete for most folks.
Yeah, folks can get their soil tested. Folks can, because nutrient stress is going to influence the bulk of disease problems that are soil-borne are going to have a stress component. And so nutrient stress, we don't understand all of those hows and whys, but we know that nutrient stress, because they stress the plants, and that makes the plants more susceptible to diseases. So really making sure that you understand your nutritional status of your field is important. And you can test your soil at the end and at the beginning of the year to get a good idea of changes that might or might not be happening, in addition to getting your cyst nematode tested for as well.
Two birds with one stone, as I like to say.
Yeah.
In terms of sorghum, anything in particular with sorghum this past season?
Stalk rots are always something to keep an eye on. Again, hidden or quiescent. So the stalk gets colonized by different fungi. Charcoal rot that we find in soybean also affects sorghum. So it can colonize the roots and the stalk, leading to reduced yield. And the one that really can be problematic, though, is fusarium. Another fungus that's soil-borne, can get into the stalks, and in some cases cause lodging. So the fungus degrades the tissue in the base of the stalk, and that degradation leads to weakness, and that weakness leads to stalks keeling over in the field, and that makes harvest really difficult, if not impossible. So, if you have a stalk rot problem, that can really affect your ability to harvest that and subtract from your overall yield.
So with those diseases, the same thing as with what we just discussed with soybeans?
Well, for charcoal rot, I think that your plant population considerations and other nutrition and trying to reduce stress is important. There is some resistance in a lot of hybrids to fusarium. It's not completely well understood. And again, I would say that for fusarium stalk rot, the environmental conditions that trigger that problem are a little bit different than charcoal rot. Charcoal rot likes it hot and dry throughout most of the season. We have a stalk rot problem caused by fusarium when we have a period of rain that kind of gets the fungus started, then stress. All right, so a little bit different there. So two different pathogens that behave and can cause similar problems, but the environment can affect them. And really I have to say that that's one of the ongoing areas of research for us, is really trying to find better sources of stalk rot resistance. And so we work really closely with the sorghum breeding program in Manhattan and the sorghum breeding program in Hayes to say, okay, let's screen these varieties and see where we have charcoal rot resistance, where we have stalk rot resistance, so that those sorghum lines can be incorporated into hybrid production and end up in farmers' fields to have better standability, better yield, under those kind of stresses that we face every year in Kansas. That's constant that we can't get away from. So resistance is always going to be our best bet.
Sure. In terms of varieties, do you guys have a guide out currently for sorghum producers?
Yes, there is a sorghum hybrid guide, and corn and wheat. All those are available through Agronomy Extension. They do indicate lodging scores around the state where they've been tested. And so I think that what growers should really be looking for are materials that have, number one, high yield. So even if you get a yield impact from some of those hidden diseases, you'll maintain high yield or have good tolerance, in other words. And make sure that there's some lodging information. Because I would say that, although there's pathogen-associated lodging, there's also physiological lodging. So environmental conditions that can cause lodging in sorghum. But either way, any variety out there that is prone to lodging should be avoided.
Good advice for producers that are tuning in currently. Now on to a subject that I'm more familiar with because of where I'm from originally. I'm from Alabama, for listeners that they don't know that. But cotton, what have we really seen with cotton?
Yeah, so cotton's been on the increase and has been a subject of good interest. And so we've started doing some cotton work, especially from materials in south central Kansas. And so this year we did a little bit of a survey and started to collect cotton seedlings south of Wichita primarily, and we're interested in cotton seedling diseases. So we really don't have any good information about the kinds of fungal pathogens that are associated with cotton in Kansas. There's information from Oklahoma, and there's a little bit of information from Missouri, but Kansas is kind of a black box. Now, we assume that some of the same things are going to show up, and they certainly have. So we've been looking at seedlings, we've been identifying fungal pathogens from those, sequencing them and culturing them and doing all those kind of fun lab kind of things so that we know what our culprits are, what we expect to see, and can advise as far as seed treatment options, look for potential seedling disease resistance and that sort of thing to have better cotton production for our upland cotton in Kansas.
Absolutely, especially as that industry, like you mentioned, continues to grow in the state. K-State wants to be a part of supplying more information for those producers that are interested in finding more.
That's right. So having a catalog or having at least some information as to here are the seedling-associated fungi that can cause a problem. And then ultimately we're looking also into mature plant wilt and root diseases as well. A couple to be on the lookout for are verticillium, which is a fungus that can really affect defoliation in cotton, which will then reduce boll size and lint quality. And another one to be on the lookout for will be the fusarium disease, fusarium wilt in cotton. So far, I haven't seen fusarium wilt, but verticillium is out there. So both of these are soil-borne pathogens that we expect to see in mature cotton plants, but right now we've really been focused more on the seedling side of things. And then this next season, hopefully we'll be looking at seedling, mid-season, and mature plant-associated diseases as well.
So research to come to look forward to from K-State in terms of cotton.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, Chris, I can't thank you enough for your time today. This is a great overview of kind of what we've seen this past season, what to expect, and kind of prepare for the season ahead. So I really do appreciate your time.
Yeah, just be on the lookout for all kinds of things that are happening under the surface that might affect your yields and quality.
Yep, just out of sight does not mean out of mind.
That's right.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you again, Chris. Once again, that was Chris Little. He is a K-State professor of plant pathology discussing seedling, root, and stem diseases of soybeans, cotton, and sorghum. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. The Executive Director of the United Nations World Food Program, David Beasley, was on the Kansas State University campus earlier this month to deliver the 2022 Fall Landon Lecture. His lecture focused on how man-made conflicts, global climate shocks, and COVID-19 have all greatly impacted the progress that WFP had been making to eliminate world hunger. Beasley said that to have this discussion on this day and in this time in world history couldn't be more appropriate.
Because we are facing unquestionably, undeniably, a food security crisis beyond anything we have seen at least since World War II. And quite frankly, it's going to get a whole lot worse in the next 24 months. We'll break this down today. When I took this role as the executive director of the World Food Program 5.5 years ago, my goal at that time was to put the World Food Program out of business. At that time, there were only 80 million people, as we would say, marching to starvation. That's different than chronic hunger. But those in severe food insecurity status are those that end up in famine, destabilization of nations, or mass migration. So I would go into a country and say, all right, you've been here 30 years, maybe it's not working. What do we need to do differently so that we create food independence, sustainability, resilience for the people in that country? Well, sadly enough, the number went, instead of going from 80 down to 0, it went from 80 to 135. That was right before COVID. So the question would be, why did it rise? And the simple answer, number one, is man-made conflict, matters of the heart. Number two was climate shocks. COVID comes along, economic devastation, disruption of supply chains around the world, especially in the poorest of the poor countries. The number went from 135 million people marching to starvation to 276 million people. These are not numbers, folks. These are real people with real names living in communities struggling to survive. The economic devastation from COVID lingered, and the coping capacity of the poorest of the poor was completely wiped away, living from hand to mouth on a day-to-day basis. Heartbreaking, tragic, from country to country. So just when you think it couldn't get any worse, you have Ethiopia war, Afghanistan, and then the breadbasket of the world, Ukraine, grows enough food to feed 400 million people, now the longest bread lines on the planet. When you take a nation that grows enough food to feed 400 million people and take it out of the market, the impact is just catastrophic. I was already saying at the end of 2021, and if you go back and watch my Nobel Peace Prize speech in December 11 months ago, you'll see us talking about 2022 pre-Ukraine would be the worst humanitarian year since World War II because of conflict, because of COVID, because of climate shocks and pricing inflation. Many leaders couldn't understand that. Then Ukraine comes along. Dozens upon dozens of nations around the planet depend upon the grain from Ukraine. 50% of what we were buying came from Ukraine. We feed, assist about 130 million people on any given day, week, or month. But the poorest of the poor countries that were relying on grain from Ukraine or fertilizers from Russia, for example, you've got dozens upon dozens of nations that were devastated. You've seen the pricing that has increased around the world, the impact that it's having on the average family in America. Imagine the impact that it has on a mother trying to feed a family in Niger when 75% of their income already goes to food, the impact that it has. In many of these very poor places, it's 7 times the cost that it was just a couple years ago. It's unprecedented what we're facing, and in the midst of all this, when all the political leaders around the world were fixated on the eastern border of Ukraine because of the military invasion by Russia, I immediately went down to Odessa and said, you've got to open these ports, which was not a simple thing because even the Ukrainians didn't want to open the ports out of fear of Russian invasion. But 50% of the Ukrainian economy, the GDP, is based on those ports. This was not just a Ukrainian matter. If Putin maintained the blockade without firing a shot along that coastline, the economy of Ukraine collapses and food security absolutely just is a tsunami on top of a perfect storm. But leaders in Ukraine and the rest of the world began to understand the significance of getting those ports open because supply chains mean everything. Now, that's as to grains, but fertilizers. It's hard to understand the impact globally when 30% of all wheat is produced out of that region like Russia and Ukraine, or 20% of all maize, corn from Russia and Ukraine, and I could go on down. Russia's the number one exporter of fertilizer. There are 8 billion people on the planet. 4 billion of those people eat because of fertilizer. I don't care if you love or hate Russia. We got to have those fertilizers. And now, because of the droughts that we're facing around the world, here in the heartland, the Midwest and the South, India, South America, the Horn of Africa, compounded with fuel costs, food costs, shipping costs, our operational expense has increased because of fuel, shipping, and food costs by over $70 million per month. Imagine what the poorest of poor are facing around the world. Kansas has been at the heart of improving the lives of people all over the world. And this morning, when I sat down with many of the students, with President Linton and Sally, and listening to the stories and listening not just to the heartbeat of these young men and women, but listening to their experience already and their expertise, I'm like, wow, I know I can teach them a few things, but I think they can teach me a lot of things. Because now they realize, because of what we are seeing around the world, that food security is a big deal. And what you're doing here at Kansas State is critical to global security. As the Nobel Peace Prize Committee said, food is the pathway to peace. And Food for Peace, which was the program that came out of Public Law 480, which was therefore the genesis for the World Food Program, you have been building that pathway to peace, which is why food security has been improving these past many decades, but we've got more work to do. Yes, we've got to improve yields. Yes, we got to improve harvest. Yes, we got to improve seeds. Yes, we got to improve fertilizer. Yes, we got to improve practices. What else do we need to do? How do we reduce waste and all the different things that must be done? But let me say, we're running out of time. We have a food pricing problem right now, but next year, we very well will have a food availability problem. If the Black Sea Grain Initiative collapses and we don't get the Russian fertilizers and the grains out of that region as we need, honestly, I don't know how we don't avert a depression by the end of next year. In 2006 and 2007, when you had the food crisis then, Along with Arab Spring in 2011, you had 48 nations that had riots, civil unrest, and protest. The economic indicators today are much, much worse. We're already seeing destabilization in many nations, riots, protests, Central America and South America. We've actually seen them in Panama, of course, Haiti, Peru, Indonesia, Chad, Burkina Faso. I could go on and on and on already. And we have nowhere hit near the bottom of what we are facing. So in the immediate, we've got a lot of work to do. But imagine when we have a world population of 10 billion people. I honestly believe that we can truly end world hunger by 2030, which was the Sustainable Development Goals adopted by the United Nations around the world. But we will never achieve that as long as we have man-made conflict. How do we do these things so we can stabilize the planet? Because we truly are facing extremely difficult times ahead, and I'm very worried. One of the things we like to do is, if I want to put the World Food Program out of business, how can we create sustainability and resilience, taking advantage of what you've done here in research and development and taking that out around the planet, scaling it up. In a lot of places, if we're providing food year in, year out, when is that going to stop unless you provide a solution? Many places about harvesting water. The poorest of the poor countries pay the price on the climate shocks. And while we've made so much progress, we've got so much more work to do. Just in the past few years, WFP, when I say that, I mean our beneficiaries, have rehabilitated over 3.5 million acres of land, built over 109,000 small ponds, small dams, reservoirs, 81,000 kilometers of feeder roads, 26,000 kilometers of irrigation lines and water canals, 380,000 community gardens. I could go on and on. It's a good investment. But we will not do it by government, United Nations, and philanthropy alone. Many of you in this room, in the private sector, in the farming community, understand the significance of what I'm about to say. The private sector is fundamental in ending poverty and hunger around the world. We must do it together.
That's David Beasley, Executive Director of the United Nations World Food Program. He delivered the 2022 Fall Landon Lecture earlier this month on the K-State campus. To watch his entire lecture, do an online search for Kansas State University Landon Lecture. This is the K-State Radio Network. From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Along with Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. Dairy product consumption data from last year identified some interesting trends. In this week's Milk Lines, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk takes a closer look at the report.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning the consumption of dairy products in the United States. Recently, the Milk Market Administrator for the Central Order published a summary of the 2021 data on dairy product consumption. Some interesting trends that we see. Some of these have been going on for some time, and some have changed more in recent years. However, as I think about producing raw milk and I think about that milk being turned into various products, I think it's important for us producers that we understand how that milk is going to be utilized and what are the trends as the consumers purchase products off the dairy shelves. Some of the trends that we're seeing is a continual increase in the consumption of dairy as cheese. A large increase in the last several years, especially as you look back to 1975 and go forward to 2021. The amount of cheese that we consume here in the United States actually has almost doubled at about 176% of the consumption that we had in 1975 when you look at the 2021 numbers. Fluid milk, on the other hand, has seen a rapid decrease. We've seen about a 45, almost 46% decline in fluid milk consumption on a per capita basis since 1975. Of concern with that is that the decline has been steeper since 2000. So we seem to be losing on the fluid milk side a little bit quicker in more recent years than we have over the longer-term trend. So as you look at cheeses, what's going up and what is kind of staying the same? All cheeses obviously are up a great deal since 1975. Where do we see the growth? Well, we see a growth actually in the more recent years in all types of cheeses actually, whether we talk about Italian or we talk about American or just other cheese products that we find on the grocery shelf. As you look at the American cheeses, we divide that a couple different ways. We look at total, but we also look at cheddar and then things other than cheddar that are included in that number. And again, the rise in cheddar cheese consumption as well as other types of American cheese has been very significant and has increased quite a bit over the last couple of years. This may be a reflection of some of the trends that we've seen due to COVID, people eating in more, eating out less, and maybe consuming more sandwiches at home that would include some cheese on top of them. Other dairy products that seem to be gaining in consumption in more recent years is yogurt. Yogurt had kind of taken a decline 4 or 5 years ago, but in the last couple of years we've seen a strong increase in yogurt consumption. Again, could be related to COVID, people eating more things at home rather than going out to eat. As you look at some of the other types of cheeses that we see, again, we see some rises in them as well. Mozzarella continues to grow as an Italian cheese. Again, this is associated with pizza consumption largely, some other Italian foods as well, but mostly with the increase in pizza consumption here in the United States. Some other things that are growing is butter consumption. Even though butter has been high priced in the store for 18 to 20 months, we still see an increase in the consumption of butter across the United States. And we're also seeing an increase in the consumption of processed cheese products as well. So overall, this report, I think, is very bright for our dairy industry. As we continue to grow our dairy industry slightly, we're going to need additional consumption here in the United States as well as increased exports in order to utilize that raw milk that's being produced and the products that result from that. And as we look forward to 2023 and growth in our dairy industry, I think you'll probably find that most of that growth will be consumed through some of the cheeses and those types of products, and again, probably much less through fluid milk. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for the Tuesday edition of Agriculture Today. For Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.